The North Sea, somewhere off the Norwegian coast. The year is 1689, and the hour is somewhere past midnight, when the boundary between what is real and what the mind constructs from fear becomes difficult to locate with any confidence. Picture the water as it exists on this particular night. Not rough, not storm-tossed, not the kind of sea that experienced sailors read as dangerous and prepare for accordingly. The water is flat, completely unnaturally flat. The kind of stillness that has no weather explanation, no tidal pattern to account for it. No name in the vocabulary of men who have spent their lives learning to read the ocean's moods and intentions. The surface reflects the stars back at themselves so perfectly that the horizon disappears, and the ship appears to be suspended in a sphere of darkness punctuated by cold light, floating between two skies, neither of which offers any comfort. The vessel is a merchant ship of modest size, built for coastal trade along the Norwegian and Icelandic routes. Her captain is a man in his mid-40s who has worked these waters since he was old enough to carry rope. He knows the North Sea the way a man knows his own home, knows its patterns and its seasons and its tempers, knows the difference between the kind of calm that precedes a productive crossing and the kind that precedes something else. He cannot say, standing at the rail on this particular night, which kind this is. He only knows that something about the quality of the silence feels wrong in a way he does not have words to explain to his crew without sounding like a man who has spent too many months at sea. Then the ship slows, not because the wind has died. The wind has not died. The sails are full. He checks them himself, walks the deck, examines the rigging. Everything is as it should be. The rudder responds. The heading is correct, but the vessel is losing way, its forward motion diminishing as if it is moving through something thicker than water, as if the sea itself is offering resistance that physics cannot account for. The first mate reports a sound, low, rhythmic, coming from below the waterline on the port side. Not the sound of the hull working in a swell, which every sailor knows intimately, which becomes background noise after the first week at sea. Something else. A scraping. A pressure. Something that suggests contact, without any reef or rock appearing on the charts, for this stretch of water, which has been sailed 100 times before without incident. Then the list begins. Gradual. Almost imperceptible at first. The ship leaning to port without explanation. No shift in cargo. No taking on of water. No asymmetry in the sails. The vessel simply begins to lean as if a hand of extraordinary size has pressed against its hull below the surface and is holding it there, testing its resistance, measuring what it has found. One of the crew leans over the port rail and looks down into the water. He says nothing for a long moment. Then he steps back from the rail, and his face, in the pale light, is not the face of a man who has seen nothing. He says there is something beneath them. That is all he says. Something beneath them. Moving. The captain does not look. He gives orders instead. Bring the ship around. Make for deeper water. Do not stop moving. And then, as suddenly as it began, it ends. The pressure releases. The list corrects. The scraping ceases. The ship moves forward again as if nothing has impeded it. The water around them remains glass flat and indifferent. Whatever was beneath them has withdrawn into the depth it came from, leaving behind no evidence of its presence, except the memory of a sound, the ghost of a lean, and 3 crew members, who will not go near the port rail for the remainder of the voyage. The captain records the encounter in the ship's log with the precise economical language of a man trained to document observation rather than interpretation. He notes the position, he notes the time, he notes the duration of the anomaly. He writes, an unexplained force acting against the hull in calm conditions, no weather cause identified, no reef or obstruction, consistent with chart data. Crew observed large submerged shape. Description unclear. He does not write the word monster. He does not speculate. He files the log with the Maritime Authority in Bergen and returns to his trade routes. And he never speaks of the night publicly. And in 10 years, no one follows up on the report. And the document sits in an archive and gathers dust alongside dozens of others that describe, in different words, the same essential experience. This is not a unique account. Between the late 1600s and the middle of the 1700s, across the fishing communities and trading ports of Norway, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands, reports like this one multiply with an insistence that begins to demand something more than dismissal. These are not the stories of frightened passengers or credulous landsmen encountering the sea for the first time. These are working sailors, men whose professional survival depends on accurate observation and honest reporting, men who have strong practical reasons to describe the ocean as it actually is rather than as their imaginations might construct it. And what they describe consistently across decades and across hundreds of miles of coastline is a sea that has changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in specific places, in specific conditions, with specific and recurring details that appear in account after account, with a consistency that is difficult to explain if the source is pure invention. The geography of the reports clusters around the deep water zones off the Norwegian coast, particularly in the areas north of Bergen and extending toward the Lofoten Islands, where the ocean floor drops to depths of several thousand feet, within relatively short distances of productive fishing grounds. This is water that coastal fishermen have worked for generations. Water they know, water that has been reliable and comprehensible for as long as anyone can remember. And yet, beginning in the latter decades of the 1600s, something about those familiar grounds begins to feel different to the men who work them. The fishing itself changes first, or rather the fishing becomes too good, and that is where the fear begins. There are mornings when cod and herring rise to the surface in numbers that experienced fishermen describe as impossible, as abundance beyond anything the season or the ground should produce, as if the fish are being driven upward by something beneath them, crowding toward the surface to escape pressure from below. Men who have fished these waters for 30 years stand in their boats, surrounded by more fish than they can possibly take, and feel not gratitude, but the specific cold unease of men who recognize that the sea is not behaving according to its own rules. They learn, over time, to read that abundance as warning, to take what they need quickly and move away from such spots, to treat the extraordinary as suspicious rather than fortunate. Then there are the smells. Mariners report an organic odor rising from the water in certain locations, thick and wrong and without visible source, described in the accounts of the period as resembling rotting fish, but deeper, more complex, as if something of enormous biological mass is present just below the surface. Fishermen who encounter this smell learn to associate it with other signs. The presence of the smell, combined with the unnatural calm and the rising fish, becomes its own kind of language, a vocabulary of warning that the sea is communicating in terms that those who know it well enough have learned to read. The water itself sometimes moves without cause, not in the way a storm moves water, not in the way a current moves water, but in the way something enormous moving just below the surface moves water, a churning and turbulence that spreads outward from no visible center, as if the sea is being disturbed from beneath by something too large and too deep to see, but not too large and too deep to affect the surface above it. And then the sounds against the hull, below the waterline, in depths where no rock or reef should be. Scraping, pressure, the sense of contact with something that has no name in the established catalogue of things the ocean contains. Sailors of this period are not, by nature or by training, imaginative men. They are practical men, shaped by work that punishes inaccuracy and rewards precision. They do not embellish their log entries. They do not tell dramatic stories in ports because dramatic stories invite skepticism, and skepticism damages the reputation for reliability that a captain depends on. When these men record anomalies, they do so because the anomalies are real enough to require recording, real enough to affect navigation decisions, real enough to matter. By the early 1700s, the accumulation of these accounts had reached a threshold where maritime communities were no longer treating them as isolated incidents. The reports were being shared, compared, and mapped against geography and season. Patterns were emerging. Certain waters, in certain conditions, at certain times of year, were becoming known as places where the sea behaved in ways that could not be explained by weather or current, or any of the familiar forces that sailors understood and had learned to navigate. They did not, at first, have a single name for what they feared. The word would come later, formalized by scholarship and written into natural histories by men who sat in warm offices in Bergen and Edinburgh, and compiled the testimonies of men who had stood at rails in the dark and felt something enormous press against their hulls from below. But the sailors knew what they knew before the name existed. They knew the signs, they knew the waters, and they knew that the ocean they had worked for generations had acquired in specific and recurring locations a quality that the word dangerous did not fully capture. The sailors didn't say Kraken at first. They said the ocean had changed. Bergen, Norway, 1752. A bishop sits at his desk in the warmth of his study and writes, with the careful hand of a man who understands that what he is putting to paper will be read by skeptics, examined by scholars, and used by posterity to judge not just the quality of his research, but the soundness of his mind. His name is Erik Pontoppidan. He is the Bishop of Bergen, a theologian and a naturalist, a man of considerable intellectual reputation, who has spent years documenting the flora and fauna of Norway with the methodical precision of someone who believes that the natural world is God's creation, and therefore deserving of the same rigorous attention one gives to Scripture. He is not a credulous man. He does not chase legends. He does not repeat stories without examining their sources. And yet, here he is, writing about the Kraken, not because he believes in sea monsters in the way that frightened children believe in them, but because over the course of his years in Bergen, he has interviewed enough sailors, enough fishermen, enough experienced maritime men whose professional competence he has had independent reason to trust, and he has found in their accounts a consistency that he cannot dismiss without abandoning the same intellectual standards he applies to every other subject he studies. The accounts agree too well. The details repeat too precisely across too many independent sources for him to conclude that what he is documenting is shared hysteria or cultural legend passed from port to port. What he is documenting, he believes, is testimony, accumulated, imperfect, sometimes exaggerated at the edges, but testimony nonetheless, pointing towards something real in the waters off the Norwegian coast. In 1752 he publishes The Natural History of Norway, and in it he includes the most detailed and serious treatment of the Kraken that any educated observer had yet committed to print. He is explicit about his methodology. He has not relied on legend. He has interviewed witnesses directly. He has cross-referenced accounts. He has applied the same standards of evidence he would apply to any natural history subject. And what he has found is a pattern so consistent across independent sources that he believes it constitutes genuine evidence of a creature of extraordinary size, inhabiting the deep waters of the Norwegian Sea. He describes a creature that rises from extreme depth in calm conditions, that when it surfaces, presents the appearance of a floating island or shoal where no island or shoal exists on any chart, that attracts enormous quantities of fish to the surface above it, as if drawing them upward through some mechanism he cannot explain, that when it descends, creates a disturbance in the water violent enough to endanger small vessels caught above it. He estimates its dimensions, with the appropriate caveat that his sources disagree, and that he is working from testimony, rather than direct observation. He acknowledges uncertainty. He acknowledges the possibility of exaggeration, but he is unequivocal on the central point. Something real is being described by multiple independent witnesses with no coordinated reason to agree. And dismissing their accounts entirely requires a kind of blanket skepticism about working sailors' observational competence that Pontoppidan is not willing to apply. His account is important, not because it settles the question, but because of what it represents. A serious, credentialed, intellectually rigorous observer taking the accumulated maritime testimony seriously enough to examine it by the standards of natural history. The Kraken is no longer purely the domain of sailors' tales, told in dockside taverns. It has entered the written record of natural philosophy. But Pontoppidan's work matters most for what it reveals about the recurring elements in the accounts he documented. Because when you read his compilation alongside the ship logs and port records and community testimonies that survive from the same period, what emerges is a pattern of extraordinary consistency, a set of details that appear again and again across accounts separated by decades and hundreds of miles, recorded by men who could not have coordinated their stories, who had no reason to invent the same specific observations. Consider what appears, repeatedly, in the record. The unnatural stillness. It appears in account after account, described with a specific quality that distinguishes it from ordinary calm. Not the stillness of a windless day, which sailors know and do not fear. Not the stillness of an early morning, before the breeze builds, which is familiar and comfortable. Something different, deeper, a quality of absolute absence that experienced mariners describe as the water holding its breath, as if some enormous presence just below the surface is drawing all movement and energy inward, leaving the world above it suspended and wrong. Sailors who had worked the same waters for decades described encountering this specific quality of stillness, and immediately knowing it was not ordinary weather. Not because they could identify a cause, but because the sea had a texture they had never felt in 30 years of crossings, and that unfamiliarity was itself a form of information. Then, the fish. This detail appears across Pontoppidan's sources, in independent ship logs, in the community testimonies of fishing villages from Norway to the Faroe Islands, and it is perhaps the most specific and verifiable element in all the accounts. Cod and herring, rising to the surface in extraordinary numbers. Not the normal abundance of a productive ground on a good day, but something beyond that. Fish crowding the surface as if driven upward by pressure from beneath, as if whatever was ascending through the water column had pushed the prey ahead of it the way a hand thrust upward through shallow water pushes everything above it toward the air. Fishermen who had worked the same grounds for 20 and 30 years described encounters with this phenomenon, and were explicit that it was not like any natural abundance they had seen before. The fish were not schooling in their usual patterns. They were not feeding. They were pressed against the surface from below, crowded together in a way that suggested flight rather than behavior. And here is the detail that over time transformed from promising sign to warning. Fishing communities along the Norwegian coast developed during the 1700s an informal practice of rowing away from spots where the fish were rising in these extraordinary numbers. They left the abundance behind. They took what they could quickly and departed, because experience had taught them, through losses and near losses, and the accumulated testimony of communities that had been working these waters for generations, that the fish rising in those particular numbers in that particular way was not a gift. It was a sign of what was coming up beneath them. The foul smell follows in the accounts with the same consistency, an organic odour rising from the water without visible source, described across independent records with vocabulary that clusters around the same sensory territory: rotting, organic, thick, wrong. A smell with no body attached to it, no dead animal visible at the surface, no debris or waste that might account for it. Just the smell, rising from water that looks entirely normal, except that it does not smell normal, and that the stillness has a quality no sailor can quite explain. Water moving without cause. This appears in accounts from fishing vessels, from coastal traders, from the logs of larger ships passing through reported encounter zones, always described in the same terms. The surface churning or boiling in a localized area, with no wind or current to account for it, as if the water is being disturbed from beneath by something moving too far below the surface to be seen, but not too far below to affect what happens above it. Sailors describe watching this phenomenon from a distance and feeling the specific dread of men who recognize that the sea is doing something outside its normal vocabulary. And then, the sounds against the hull. This is where the accounts move from atmospheric observation into something more concrete, something with physical implications. Sailors below deck, on vessels passing through waters associated with Kraken reports, describe hearing sounds against the hull below the waterline, not the sound of the hull flexing in a swell, which every experienced sailor can identify instantly, not the sound of a light debris or seaweed dragging along the planking, which is also familiar, something heavier, something that suggests contact with an object of size, a pressure and a scraping in the lower hull that has no source in the charts and no weather explanation in the conditions. Some ships investigate and find nothing. Some return to port with marks on their lower planking that the shipwrights who examine them cannot account for. Some simply note the sound in their logs and continue their crossing, because what else is there to do? Because the sea is full of things you cannot see, and you navigate it anyway, or you stay home. The loss of maneuverability is the final element, and it is perhaps the most alarming because it is the most practical. Ships in otherwise navigable conditions suddenly losing the ability to steer, to maintain headway, to respond to the rudder in the way that physics and the vessel's known characteristics would predict. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, not in a way that immediately endangers the ship, but perceptibly, measurably, in a way that experienced captains notice and cannot explain through any reference to weather, current, or mechanical failure. What is significant about these elements, taken together, is not that any one of them is inexplicable in isolation. Calm water happens, fish schools, behave unpredictably, smells drift across open water without clear origin, sounds carry strangely through hull planking, ships lose way for reasons that are difficult to diagnose at sea. What is significant is that these particular elements appear together, in the same sequence, in accounts from across decades and across hundreds of miles of coastline, recorded by men who had no access to each other's logs and no reason to coordinate the details of their stories. The pattern does not prove anything with certainty, but it is a pattern, and patterns in the testimony of independent, competent observers are the beginning of knowledge, not its end. There is also the psychological dimension that Pontoppidan notes with particular care, because it tells you something important about what these sailors actually believed they were experiencing. Traditional maritime fear is oriented toward visible danger. Storms are terrifying because they are enormous and violent, and you can see them coming and still cannot always survive them. Reefs are terrifying because they are hidden but fixed, locatable on charts, avoidable with sufficient knowledge and care. Even other ships, pirates and enemies are visible, human, comprehensible, within a framework of known threats that experienced sailors have developed strategies for managing. This was different. This came in the conditions that were supposed to be safe. It came in the calm, in the clear, in the familiar waters that sailors had crossed without incident 100 times before. It could not be predicted by reading the sky or the charts. It could not be prepared for through skill or knowledge or seamanship. The only warning was a quality of stillness that you had to have experienced before in order to recognize, and by the time you recognized it, you were already in it. Sailors of this period began to express in port conversations and in the margins of their logs, and in the letters they sent home from distant anchorages, a fear of calm water that strikes the modern reader as counterintuitive, but that makes complete sense once you understand what they believed was living in it. Storms are visible. You can see a storm. You can prepare for a storm. You can, with enough experience and enough skill and enough luck, survive a storm and tell the story afterward. This was not visible. This came from below, from a depth the eye could not reach, in the conditions that every maritime calculation said were the safest available. It undermined the one thing that experienced sailors had that allowed them to keep going to sea: the belief that knowledge and competence and attention were sufficient protection against the worst the ocean could offer. If this was hysteria, if these accounts were the product of collective imagination and the human tendency to construct stories that explain what cannot be understood, then the question that Pontoppidan asked in 1752, and that the accumulated record continues to ask, is simply this: why were the details so consistent? Bergen, 1741. A shipwright named Halvard Dahl stands in the dry dock examining the lower hull of a coastal trading vessel that returned to port 3 days ago with damage its captain cannot explain. The ship encountered nothing on its passage. No storm, no reef, no collision. The weather log shows clear conditions for the entirety of the crossing. The charts for the wreck show open water, no obstructions, no shoals in the vicinity of the reported anomaly. The captain is a man Dahl has worked with for 11 years, a man whose professional reputation rests on accurate reporting, a man who has no reason to fabricate damage or to misrepresent the circumstances under which it occurred. And yet the whole tells a story that the voyage log cannot account for. Dahl runs his hand along the lower planking, below the waterline, on the port side. The wood here has been compressed and scored in a pattern he has not seen in 20 years, of examining storm-damaged, reef-damaged, and collision-damaged vessels. The marks are not linear, not the long gouges left by rock contact, not the splintered impact damage left by collision with debris or ice. They are circular, roughly circular, repeating at irregular intervals along a stretch of planking approximately 12 feet in length. The wood within each circle has been compressed inward, as if something cylindrical and very strong pressed against the hull with sustained force rather than sudden impact. Dahl examines the marks for a long time. He brings his apprentice over and asks him what he sees. His apprentice, who has not yet developed the professional reluctance to speculate that experience teaches, says it looks like something gripped the hull, like fingers, but bigger. Dahl does not write that in his assessment. He writes, hull damage of unknown origin, lower portside planking, circular compression marks inconsistent with reef contact or weather damage. Cause not determined, planking to be replaced before next. Voyage. He files the report, replaces the damaged planking, and collects his fee. He does not discuss the marks publicly. He is a practical man, and this is a practical business, and there is nothing practical about speculating in port, about what might be living in the water beneath the ships he is paid to repair. But he has seen these marks before, not often, twice in the previous decade, on 2 different vessels, from 2 different captains, on 2 different routes, always below the waterline, always circular, always with that same quality of sustained pressure rather than impact, as if something had held on rather than struck. He keeps no formal record of the pattern. He is a shipwright, not a naturalist, but he remembers it, and the memory sits in the back of his professional mind, like a question he has no framework to answer. This is the category of evidence that the written record of the period contains in fragments and in pieces, scattered across dry dock assessments and insurance claim documents and port authority records from Norway, Iceland, and the northern reaches of the Scottish coast. Individual reports, filed by practical men in practical language, describing damage to ship hulls that does not fit the established categories of maritime damage, and that therefore accumulates in archives without anyone connecting the marks on one ship to the marks on another, without anyone asking whether the pattern across cases tells a story that the individual cases cannot tell alone. The damage descriptions share common features across these scattered records. The location is almost always below the waterline, in the lower third of the hull, in regions that would correspond to the depth at which a large submerged creature might make contact with a passing vessel. The marks are not the random scarring of reef contact, which tends to be linear and directional, following the movement of the ship across a fixed obstacle. They suggest something that moved with the ship or against it, in a sustained encounter rather than a glancing collision. Some reports describe broken or twisted rudder mechanisms with no explanation in the voyage record. A rudder damaged by storm stress fails in specific ways that experienced shipwrights recognize immediately. A rudder damaged by reef contact shows impact marks at the point of contact. These rudders show something different: twisting forces applied from below, deformation, consistent with something pulling downward on the rudder blade with substantial mass, as if the mechanism had been gripped and wrenched rather than struck. Captains who returned with this kind of damage were in a difficult professional position. Claiming storm damage when the weather log shows clear conditions invites scrutiny of the log's accuracy. Claiming reef contact when the charts show open water invites scrutiny of the navigator's competence. Claiming unexplained force invites a different kind of scrutiny entirely, the kind that questions a man's fitness for command on grounds that have nothing to do with seamanship. Most chose the most professionally defensible option. They recorded the damage as cause undetermined and said nothing more. The insurance assessors, who had their own reasons to prefer clear causal explanations, pressed for specifics that the captains could not honestly provide. The claims were sometimes disputed, sometimes paid with notations of disputed cause, sometimes quietly settled in ways that left no useful record for posterity. What this means is that the physical evidence of hull encounters during this period is almost certainly underrepresented in the archive. Every practical incentive pointed away from honest reporting of anomalous damage. The damage that is recorded is what survived despite those incentives, which suggests that the actual frequency of such encounters was considerably higher than what the documentary record shows. It is worth dwelling on what the circular compression marks mean in the context of what was being described in the same waters during the same period. The The sailors reporting encounters described arms. They described appendages rising from the water, wrapping around or pressing against hull structures, creating the sensation of being gripped rather than struck. The shipwrights examining hulls were finding marks consistent with exactly that description: circular, pressure-based, sustained, rather than impact-based, located where the arms of something large ascending beneath a vessel would make contact with the hull. Neither group had access to the other's observations in any systematic way. The sailors were not reading dry dock assessments. The shipwrights were not compiling maritime encounter testimonies. The convergence between what the sailors described and what the physical evidence showed was not the product of shared narrative. It was the product of two independent sets of observers describing the same event from different vantage points. And then, in 1735, something changed. Not in the waters, not in the frequency of reports, but in the intellectual status of what those reports described. Carl Linnaeus was 38 years old when he published the first edition of Systema Naturae, the foundational text of biological taxonomy, the work that introduced the classification system that would become the organizing framework for all of natural history. Linnaeus was a man of extraordinary methodological rigor. His classification system was built on the principle that only real, verifiable organisms belonged in the catalogue. He was not in the business of legitimizing legend. He was in the business of ordering the natural world according to the evidence available to careful observation. In the first edition of Systema Naturae, Linnaeus included the kraken. He classified it under the name Microcosmus marinus, placing it within his taxonomy of sea creatures alongside whales and sharks and the other large marine animals whose existence no educated person disputed. He did not include it as a curiosity or a footnote. He included it as a real organism on the basis of the accumulated evidence that something of extraordinary size inhabited the deep waters of the northern seas. Consider what that decision represented. Linnaeus was the most rigorous taxonomist of his era. His professional reputation rested entirely on the accuracy and defensibility of his classifications. Including a creature in Systema Naturae was not a casual act. It was a formal scientific statement that the evidence for the creature's existence met the threshold required for biological recognition. When Linnaeus included the kraken, he was saying with the full authority of the most respected natural philosopher of his generation that the sailors' reports were worth taking seriously as natural history evidence rather than dismissing as maritime folklore. He would later remove the kraken from subsequent editions, apparently concluding that the evidence did not yet meet the standard required for formal classification in a maturing scientific system that demanded specimen-based verification. But the initial inclusion matters more than the retraction. It marks a specific historical moment, the point at which the accumulated testimony of sailors, shipwrights, and maritime observers crossed into scientific discourse. The myth entered science, and once inside, it could not be entirely removed. Naturalists who had previously felt professionally obligated to dismiss kraken reports now had grounds to take them seriously without damaging their own reputations. Academics began examining the testimonies with the tools of natural philosophy rather than the dismissal of folklore. The question shifted, as it had to shift once a credible scientist had staked professional ground on the creature's existence. The question was no longer whether something was in the water. The question was what it was and how, large, and what it was capable of. This shift in intellectual standing had a practical consequence that is easy to overlook. Once the kraken occupied scientific space, the sailors' accounts were no longer simply stories. They were data points. They were evidence in an ongoing investigation. And when you read them as data points rather than stories, when you strip away the dramatic framing that inevitably accumulates around any account that passes through multiple tellings, what remains is a set of observations that are anatomically specific in ways that are very difficult to explain as invention. The sailors described arms, multiple, flexible, long. They described suckers, or something functioning like suckers, circular attachments capable of gripping wood and leaving marks. They described mass of an order that suggested a creature far larger than any squid or octopus in the known natural catalogue. They described deep-sea origin, a creature that came from below, from the kind of depth that ships pass over daily without any awareness of what lies there. Here's what makes these descriptions remarkable. The giant squid, Architeuthis dux, would not receive formal scientific confirmation until the 1870s, when specimens began washing ashore on the Newfoundland coast in numbers sufficient to allow systematic study. For 140 years, after the sailors of the 1700s were filing their hull damage reports and their encounter testimonies, the animal whose anatomy they were describing simply did not officially exist. There was no scientific model for it. There was no published description of its anatomy that a Norwegian fisherman in 1740 could have read and incorporated into his account. And yet the anatomy they described, the arms, the circular attachment structures, the enormous mass, the deep-sea habitat, the surface ascent under specific conditions, maps with disturbing precision onto the creature that science would eventually confirm was real and was living in exactly the waters where these reports originated. The sailors were describing anatomy before anatomy had a scientific framework to contain it. Whether the damage to those hulls in the dry docks of Bergen and Reykjavik came from Architeuthis or from some other deep-sea encounter, that the evidence is no longer sufficient to identify with precision. The physical record and the testimonial record point in the same direction. Something was in the water, something that gripped rather than struck, something that left circular marks in wood and snapped rudder mechanisms, and pressed against holes in the calm water that sailors had learned to fear more than any storm. The myth had entered science, and that meant the reports were no longer just stories told by frightened men at the edges of the known world. They were evidence, imperfect, incomplete, gathered without the methods that formal science would eventually require, but evidence nonetheless. And evidence, unlike legend, demands an explanation. There is a particular kind of loss that the sea specializes in, one that has no equivalent on land. When a ship disappears at sea, it does not leave the evidence that other disasters leave. A fire leaves ash and ruin. A flood leaves watermarks and debris. A collapse leaves rubble. But the sea, when it takes something, can take everything. The ship, the cargo, the crew, the log, the letters men were carrying home to their families. The evidence and the witnesses, simultaneously. Nothing left on the surface but the ordinary, unremarkable water that was there before the ship arrived, and is still there after it is gone. This is the category of loss that begins to compound in the middle decades of the 1700s, in the deep water zones off the Norwegian and Icelandic coasts, where the Kraken reports have been clustering for generations. Not damaged ships returning to port with marks on their hulls and shaken crews with stories they are reluctant to tell. Not encounters that end in the relief of open water and resumed headway. Ships that leave port, enter specific waters, and do not arrive anywhere, ever. Understand first what normal maritime loss looked like in this period, because context matters here, and honesty about risk matters more. The North Atlantic in the 1700s was a genuinely, routinely fatal environment. Ships were lost to storms that built faster than forecasting could track. They were lost to navigational errors in a period when charts were imprecise and instruments were unreliable. They were lost to structural failures in wooden hulls that could be weakened by rot or worm damage, that even experienced shipwrights missed an inspection. They were lost to disease that killed enough of a crew to leave a vessel unmanageable. They were lost to ice, to fire aboard, to errors of judgment that experienced men made in conditions that punished any mistake without mercy. The sea did not need a monster to kill ships. It was perfectly capable of doing so through entirely natural and comprehensible means. Any honest accounting of maritime disappearances in this period must begin with that acknowledgement, and it must hold that acknowledgement throughout, because the alternative is to treat every unexplained loss as evidence of something extraordinary, which is neither intellectually honest nor historically defensible. But there is a subset of disappearances in the record, in specific waters, under specific conditions, that sits uneasily alongside the routine losses. Vessels lost in calm conditions, on routes they had sailed successfully dozens of times before, in seasons with no significant weather, crewed by experienced men who had every reason and every competence to bring their ships home safely. Losses that do not fit the patterns of ordinary maritime attrition, and that accumulate over decades in specific geographic zones, with a consistency that is difficult to attribute entirely to coincidence. The geography is the first thing that troubles the record. The disappearances that generated the most sustained community concern during this period are not scattered randomly across the North Atlantic. They cluster. They cluster in the same deep water zones off the Norwegian coast that appear repeatedly in the Kraken encounter testimonies. The same waters where ships report the unnatural stillness, and the rising fish and the hull sounds, and the unexplained drag. The same waters where fishermen have learned, over decades of accumulated loss, to approach with a specific quality of attention that they do not bring to other grounds. The same waters that Pontoppidan's sources identified, independently of each other, as the locations where encounters were most likely to occur. This clustering is not proof of anything beyond geography. Deep water has its own hazards that are entirely natural, including unpredictable upwellings and current interactions that can create conditions dangerous to small vessels without any biological agency involved. But the sailors working these routes knew those hazards. They had been navigating the same waters for generations. The natural dangers were known and charted and accounted for in the way experienced men account for known risks. They built those risks into their decisions about when to sail and how to sail, and what conditions to avoid. What they could not account for was the subset of losses that fit no pattern they recognized, that occurred in the conditions their training said were safe, that left no evidence behind that their experience told them should have been there. Fishing boats gone without debris. This is the detail that communities return to again and again in the testimonies and port records of the period. When a boat goes down in a storm, the sea returns things. Spars, barrels, personal effects, the flotsam of a life, interrupted violently, scattered across the surface in patterns that experienced maritime communities had learned to read with a kind of grim fluency. Where the debris is, roughly how long ago the vessel went down, from which direction the weather was blowing when it happened. The debris was often the only evidence available, and it contained information if you knew how to interpret it. But certain losses in certain waters return nothing. No planking, no rope, no personal belongings, no bodies. The absence of debris was noted specifically and repeatedly in community accounts and port records because it was anomalous, because experienced maritime communities understood that the sea, when it sank ships, left traces, and the absence of traces was itself a form of evidence pointing towards something outside the normal vocabulary of maritime loss, something that did not scatter a vessel across the surface when it claimed it, something that took it whole, or took it in a manner that left the surface undisturbed. The human weight beneath this practical observation cannot be overstated. These were small communities, where everyone knew everyone, where the men who went out on those boats were known by name and by character and by the specific quality of their presence, in a community that depended on each of its members in practical daily ways. The absence of debris meant the absence of closure, no body to bury, no wreckage to confirm what had happened or where, no evidence to carry back to a wife or mother or child and say, this is what remains, this is proof that he existed, and that the sea took him, and that it is finished now, and you can begin to grieve properly. Instead, there was only the boat's failure to return, and the water that offered no explanation, and the families who waited in port, past the time when they should reasonably have stopped waiting, because the alternative to waiting was accepting a loss that had no shape, and no evidence, and no story attached to it, only absence, where a person used to be. The community grief of maritime disappearance is its own specific thing, different from the grief of other losses. It has no endpoint. There is no moment when the evidence arrives and the uncertainty resolves, and the mourning can begin in earnest. There is only the gradual, reluctant transition from waiting to acknowledging, from hope to the particular exhaustion of hope that has been sustained too long against evidence that will not come. By the middle of the 1700s, certain fishing grounds that had been productive for generations were being quietly abandoned, not by official decree, not by any formal community decision that would appear in a record, but by the slow accumulation of individual choices, each one made independently by men who weighed the catch available against what those particular waters had cost their community in recent memory, and decided, without announcing the decision publicly, that the calculation no longer worked in their favor. This voluntary withdrawal from productive grounds was economically significant in a way that is easy to underestimate from the distance of centuries. These were communities whose survival through winter depended directly on what they could take from the sea in the productive months. The margins were not generous. Walking away from good fishing grounds had direct consequences for whether families would eat adequately through the cold season, for whether communities could maintain the level of provision they had established in previous generations. There was no surplus that made the loss of productive grounds merely inconvenient. The loss was felt immediately and practically. The men making those decisions understood exactly what they were choosing. They had families to feed and obligations to meet, and every practical incentive to keep working the grounds that had sustained their communities for generations. They withdrew anyway, which tells you, with more precision than any single dramatic account could, what those men believed those waters contained and what they had concluded about the cost of continuing to work them. Now, consider a specific morning. The year is 1748. The location is a small fishing community on the Norwegian coast north of Bergen, in the vicinity of waters that appear in Kraken reports with regularity in the decades preceding the date. A fishing vessel of modest size, crewed by 4 men. The skipper has worked these waters for more than 20 years. He knows the route intimately, the grounds, the seasonal patterns, the specific character of this stretch of coastline in every kind of weather and every kind of light. He has crossed these waters in conditions far more challenging than what the morning offers. Clear sky, no wind, the flat calm that should make navigation simple and comfortable and safe. He is not a frightened man. He is not an inexperienced man. He is exactly the kind of man who should be able to make this crossing without incident. The fish are rising before they reach the grounds. This he notes, with the specific quality of attention that experience has taught him to give to this particular sign. The abundance that 2 decades of working these waters has taught him to read as warning rather than reward. He stands at the rail and watches the cod crowding the surface and feels the unease that has no rational basis. He can defend to his crew, but that his body registers with the certainty of a man whose survival has depended on learning to trust this specific feeling. He considers turning back. He has been considering turning back more often in recent seasons, more often than he used to, more often than the weather or the conditions or any practical calculation strictly requires. But the season is advancing and the community needs what the grounds can provide. And the morning is so clear and the distance is so short. And he has made this crossing so many times before without incident. The practical pressures that have governed his working life for 2 decades press against the unease that has no name and no defensible basis. He gives the order to continue. The sea goes still in the specific way before they have travelled another half-mile. Not the ordinary still of the windless morning they set out in, which is a stillness with texture, with the small movements that open water always carries even in the calmest conditions. This is the deeper stillness, the quality of absolute suspension that men who have felt it describe as the water holding itself, drawing inward, as if something of enormous mass just below the surface has stilled everything above it through sheer presence. The skipper has heard this stillness, described by other men in port. He has dismissed their descriptions as the product of retrospective fear. He understands now that they were describing accurately. Then the drag, the slowing of the vessel without cause, the loss of forward way in a boat that should be making easy progress in conditions that offer no resistance. He checks the sail. He checks the rudder. Everything responds as it should. But the boat is losing way, decelerating against no visible force, as if the water itself has thickened beneath them. Then the list, the slow and inexplicable lean to one side, the hull pressing down into the water on the port side without any mechanical explanation, without any shift in cargo or change in conditions to account for it. The water around them begins to move in the churning, boiling pattern, with no wind or current to explain the disturbance. The surface that was glass flat moments ago is now alive with movement that has no source any of the 4 men can identify. The skipper gives the order to row clear. 4 men on oars, working hard, finding water with every stroke, moving the boat forward in increments that are not enough, not nearly enough. The masts tilt toward the water. You do not know what happens in the moments after that because no one who was present for those moments survived to describe them. What reaches the shore is nothing. The same water that was there before the boat arrived is still there after it is gone. The same flat surface, the same clear sky reflecting back at itself in the undisturbed water below. The same ordinary, unremarkable morning that offers no evidence of what it has just witnessed. The families wait. Other boats go out to look and return without anything to bring back, without wreckage to confirm, without bodies to bury. Just the absence where 4 men used to be, and the water that holds no record of what it has taken. The community adds the names to the private accounting it has been keeping for years. The accumulation of men lost in specific waters, under specific conditions that do not fit the explanations available for ordinary maritime loss. They carry it the way maritime communities have always carried their losses, internally, collectively, in the specific grief of people who understand that the sea takes some of those who go out on it, and who cannot fully accept that these particular takings, in these particular waters, under these particular conditions, are simply the ordinary price of working lives at sea. 1 disappearance is tragedy, 2 is terrible fortune. But when the losses cluster in the same waters, over the same decades, when the geography of disappearance maps onto the geography of encounter reports, with a consistency that exceeds what chance distribution would predict, when experienced men who have every practical reason to keep working productive grounds begin quietly, individually, without coordination or announcement, withdrawing from those grounds because what they have cost has exceeded what any catch can justify. The word that eventually stops appearing in the community's private accounting of what it knows and what it has accepted is coincidence. When enough ships fail to return, sailors stop calling it coincidence. The 1870s arrived with something the preceding 2 centuries of maritime testimony had never been able to provide: bodies. Not the bodies of sailors, not the debris of ships, but the bodies of the thing itself, or something close enough to what had been described across generations of encounter accounts that the connection was impossible to ignore for anyone willing to examine the evidence without the predetermined conclusion that the sailors had been inventing what they reported. It began in the autumn of 1871 on the coast of Newfoundland, when fishermen working near Conception Bay discovered a mass of tissue stranded in shallow water. It was unlike anything they had encountered before. The animal, or what remained of it, was partially decomposed and damaged beyond easy identification, but its dimensions were not ambiguous. The tentacles alone extended beyond 30 feet. The body, what remained of it, was larger than anything in the documented catalogue of known marine animals that would have any business in those waters. Word reached naturalists, specimens were collected, and over the following decade, in a concentrated period that remains one of the strangest episodes in the history of natural history, giant squid began washing ashore along the Newfoundland coast with a frequency that suggested either an extraordinary change in the ocean or an extraordinary change in human attention to what the ocean had always been depositing on its shores. Between 1871 and 1881, more confirmed giant squid specimens were recovered and examined by scientists than in all of recorded human history. Before that point combined, the scientific community finally had bodies to examine, and what those bodies revealed transformed the accumulated maritime testimony of the previous 2 centuries from contested folklore into something that required a fundamentally different kind of explanation. The animal was Architeuthis dux, the giant squid, an organism that had been living in the deep waters of the world's oceans for millions of years before the first human being ever built a boat to cross them, that had left traces in the fossil record and in the scarred hides of sperm whales, and in the ancient oral traditions of coastal peoples across multiple continents, and that had been described in functional anatomical detail by Norwegian and Icelandic sailors 140 years before science confirmed it existed. Consider what the specimens revealed when examined systematically. The length first, fully extended, with the 2 long tentacles included. Mature specimens reach between 40 and 60 feet, with credible reports of larger animals that were never preserved well enough for precise measurement. Then the mass. Adult specimens weighed in excess of 400 pounds, with the largest confirmed individuals exceeding 600. This is not the mass of an animal whose presence near a ship's hull would go unnoticed. This is the mass of something whose contact with a wooden hull would leave exactly the kind of marks that shipwrights in Bergen and Reykjavik had been documenting and filing under cause undetermined for the better part of a century. The eyes. The eyes of Architeuthis are the largest of any known living animal, reaching up to 10 inches in diameter in mature specimens. They are evolved specifically for vision in near-total darkness, at extreme depth, capable of detecting bioluminescent light at distances that would be impossible for any eye designed for surface conditions. They are the eyes of an animal built for a world of pressure and cold and permanent darkness, an animal whose entire biology is an adaptation to an environment that exists thousands of feet below the surface where ships sail and fishermen cast their nets. The arms. 8. Lined with suckers that in mature specimens bear sharp serrated rings of chitin capable of leaving circular wounds in whatever they grip with sufficient force. The suckers are not smooth. They are not gentle. They are tools for holding prey that does not want to be held, designed to grip and tear and maintain contact against the force of whatever is trying to escape. The circular compression marks in the hull planking of ships that return to Bergen with damage their captains could not explain. The depressions in wood that shipwright Halvard Dahl examined with his hands, and could not assign to any category of known damage. Those marks had a biological explanation that simply did not exist in any publicly available scientific framework when the damage was occurring. The beak, hard, chitinous, parrot-like in structure, positioned at the center of the arm crown, capable of cutting through tough material with the mechanical efficiency of a tool designed for exactly that purpose. Sperm whales recovered in this period bore circular scars on their heads and bodies from encounters with giant squid, scars whose dimensions corresponded to sucker rings from animals of extraordinary size, confirming that what the sailors had been describing as arms capable of gripping a ship's hull were arms that routinely engaged in physical contests with the largest predators in the ocean, the habitat, the mesopelagic and bathypelagic zones, between 1,000 and 4,000 feet of depth, in water temperatures near freezing, under pressure that would kill a human being instantly. This is where Architeuthis lives. This is where it hunts, where it mates, where it spends the entirety of its existence under normal conditions. The surface, the shallow water, where ships sail and fish are caught, and sailors conduct their working lives, is not its environment. It has no more natural reason to be at the surface than a deep cave animal has reason to emerge into open daylight, which is precisely where the darker question enters, the one that the confirmation of the giant squid's existence does not answer, the one that the specimens washing ashore in Newfoundland in the 1870s make more urgent rather than less. If Architeuthis belongs in the deep, what brings it to the surface? What changes the calculus of an animal that evolved specifically for extreme depth, extreme cold, and extreme darkness? An animal whose eyes are built for the absence of light, and whose body is built for pressure that the surface cannot provide, to make the hostile, bright, warm, low-pressure environment of the surface layer preferable to the environment it came from. The possibilities are not comforting, and none of them are fully resolved by the evidence available. Injury is the first. Sperm whales are the primary known predator of giant squid, and the physical evidence of their encounters is preserved in the scarred bodies of whales and in the squid beaks recovered from whale stomachs in quantities that indicate these confrontations are frequent and sometimes prolonged. A squid fleeing or seriously injured in an encounter with a sperm whale might ascend rapidly through the water column in a behavioral response that takes it far above its normal depth range. Disoriented, injured, driven by the blind biological imperative to escape the predator rather than to maintain depth, it might reach the surface in a state that has nothing to do with intentional behavior and everything to do with survival reflex. The encounters with ship hulls might be, in this reading, the encounters of injured animals in distress, moving through unfamiliar water, responding to the shadow and obstruction of a hull, the way any large animal responds to obstacles encountered in conditions of extreme stress. Starvation is the second possibility, and it is less easily contained. If prey populations in the deep water where Architeuthis feeds decline significantly, a starving animal might ascend through the water column in search of food, following the distribution of prey upward through zones that are not its natural habitat. Deep-sea food chains are connected to surface ecosystems through the vertical migration of mid-water species that descend during daylight and ascend at night. A disruption in those mid-water populations, a reduction significant enough to create genuine scarcity at depth, might drive deep-sea predators upward in ways that brought them into contact with the surface world that their biology did not otherwise require. And here the third possibility enters, the one that reframes the entire 2 centuries of maritime testimony in a way that is most difficult to set aside. Overfishing. The 1700s were not a period of restrained or careful fishing in the North Atlantic. They were a period of intensifying commercial exploitation of cod, herring, and the mid-water species that form the base of the food chains connecting the surface ocean to the deep. British, Norwegian, Icelandic, and Dutch fishing fleets were removing fish from these waters at scales that had no precedent in the centuries before industrial fishing methods were developed. The removal of enormous quantities of mid-water prey could have disrupted deep-sea ecosystems in ways that drove their predators toward the surface. The ships that were sailing over the Kraken encounter zones were not simply passing through neutral water. They represented, and depended upon, an industry that was actively altering the ecology of the ocean beneath them, removing the organisms that kept deep-sea predators at depth, pulling the threads of a food web whose full extent and consequences no one in the 1700s had the conceptual framework to understand. Maybe the ocean did not start attacking ships. Maybe ships started entering territory they did not understand, in ways they could not perceive, altering conditions they had no awareness of, and the encounters that sailors recorded in their logs and described to bishops and feared in the calm water before dawn were one consequence among many of a relationship. Where the encounters clustered were the waters where the giant squid's habitat comes closest to the surface, where the extreme depth of the Norwegian Sea sits beneath productive fishing grounds that drew both human vessels and the prey that fed the animals below them. Whether the encounters were the result of injured animals, starving animals, or animals displaced by changes in the ecosystem that the ships themselves had helped create, the sailors were not wrong about what they saw. They were simply the first people to encounter, without any framework for understanding it, the evidence that the ocean was far more inhabited than the surface suggested, and that the boundary between the world ships traveled and the world that existed below them was less fixed, less permanent, and less protective than anyone had assumed. Now the water is still again. A ship drifts in the deep water zone north of Bergen, its crew at the rail in the grey hour before dawn. The sea is flat, unnaturally flat. The fish are at the surface, crowding upward in numbers that make no immediate sense. The smell is there, faint but present, organic and wrong. One of the crew looks over the rail into the water below the hull. The surface is dark, opaque, reflecting nothing. He cannot see what is beneath them. That is not the same as nothing being there. It has always been there, moving through water that ships have been crossing for centuries, without understanding what they were crossing over, in the darkness and the cold and the pressure, in the world that exists below the world, that humans navigate and name and believe they understand. Tonight it does not rise, but the water is still, and the fish are at the surface, and somewhere in the darkness below the hull, at a depth the eye cannot reach, and the mind struggles to fully accept, something enormous is moving. It has always been moving.